Hi, I'm Bob Baulch with the That's Jesus channel. We are in a book study on Earl Irvin West's The Search for the Ancient Order. And in the last video, the closing chapter of volume 1, we walked through the trends of the times. We watched men inside the Brotherhood like Milligan and Richardson and Errett. They loosened the old positions in the years before the Civil War, and we watched conservatives like Laird and Franklin and Fanning start to sound the alarm. So the war ended. The Brotherhood had not formally divided like a lot of other denominations did, but the storm clouds were already on the horizon. And today we are in volume 2, chapter 1, titled Rebirth of the Gospel Advocate. Now, volume 2 opens in the closing weeks of 1865. The South lay in ruins, the Brotherhood was scattered, and one man got into a buggy. So a horse and buggy, they move slowly up a lonely pike south of Nashville. The lone occupant is a squat, middle-aged man. There's nothing in his appearance to suggest that he's a preacher, and he himself does not think of his main work that way. He's just a farmer, and his home is 12 miles south of Nashville on a small country road, what J.M. Barnes later described as simply what the Hillsbury pike turns into after it stops being a proper pike. So the horse and the buggy, they creep up into the city limits, and the streets are crowded with blue-clad federal soldiers. They're there under orders to keep the peace. And here and there, loitering aimlessly, are young men still wearing the gray uniforms, silent and bitter. They have come back from the war to burned houses and farms that are ruined by what war always does. So the buggy pulls up in front of a dingy printing office. The lone occupant steps down, ties the horse, and walks inside. He lays an armload of handwritten pages on the table, and the printer looks over the copy for the first issue of the Gospel Advocate to appear since the war began. And the date will be January 1st, 1866. The masthead will carry two names, T. Fanning and D. Lipscomb. So the man climbs back into his buggy. He heads home. His name is David Lipscomb. And for the next 40 years, that guy, David Lipscomb, will be the leading name among the churches in the South. So the country was devastated after the Civil War. The South had been beaten. Her fields lay bare. Her cities were wrecked. Her young men, they lay buried on the battlefields. E.G. Sewell, who lived south of Nashville, later described what it was like. He remembered standing in his yard or sitting in his house, hearing the dull thunder of artillery in the distance and knowing that great battles were underway and that men were being hurried into eternity. They were dying, and he remembered the harsh, rapid crackle of small arms fire. His home lay between Franklin and Nashville during General Hood's campaign. And after the battle at Franklin, when the Union Army fell backward toward Nashville and the Confederates moved in the same direction, families along the way had to feed waves of stragglers from both sides. By the time the armies had passed, the cupboards were bare. Lincoln had been assassinated by now. Inflation, hunger, hatred rippled through the land, and the whole nation seemed to sit under a dark cloud. Observers had often said that the political condition of a nation eventually shows up in the condition of the church. And the Restoration Movement, that Stone Campbell movement, it was about to face the hardest conflicts that it had yet seen. So, to understand the Gospel Advocate, you have to understand David Lipscomb. He was born in Franklin County, Tennessee in 1831 at a time when his father, Granville Lipscomb, was raising a family in what was practically the wilderness back then. There was no mail service. Newspapers never reached the farms, and the roads were twisting lines of mud. Granville and his two brothers had belonged to the Primitive Baptist Church on Beans Creek, and they began reading the Christian Baptist. Now, that Christian Baptist, that was, Alexander Campbell's baby. You remember that? They concluded that they should take the Bible alone as their rule of faith and practice, and for that, they were put on trial for heresy, and they were removed from the Baptist fellowship. Not long after that, the three brothers became convinced that slavery itself was against the will of God, and in 1835, they moved their families and their slaves to Sangamon County, Illinois, near Springfield, and there they freed their slaves. A tragedy followed. Two daughters and a son died. Then David's mother died. And discouraged and grieving, Granville moved the remaining family back to Tennessee. David was the youngest of three surviving children, all suffering from malaria and, as he later remembered, about as close to death as they could be while still being alive. Back in Tennessee, Granville Lipscomb became a moderately prosperous farmer. He did buy a few slaves again, but he read the Bible to them and had someone in the family teach them to read and write. David later said that some of his deepest early impressions of God came through an older black woman in the household, almost certainly one of those slaves. In 1845, when David was 14, Tolbert Fanning came through Franklin County preaching, and young David had just recovered from typhoid fever. Without telling anyone his plan, young David, sent for Tolbert Fanning. And when Tolbert Fanning asked why he wanted to be baptized, David said that his reason was simple. He wanted to obey God. So Tolbert Fanning baptized him. In January of 1846, Lipscomb enrolled at Franklin College. He finished the course in 3 years as valedictorian. He became Fanning's protege. He took on Fanning's fierce independence, and he also took on Fanning's positions on missionary societies, on Christian participation in war, and on church organization. West says that of all men living, Lipscomb reflected Fanning's outlook the most. So after college, David Lipscomb came home. He farmed. He even owned a few slaves himself. By every outward measure, he was a successful farmer. He did not see himself as a preacher. He was naturally shy, by the way. Standing in front of an audience embarrassed him deeply. His first effort at preaching was a complete failure. Been there. Sorry about that. Was a complete failure. An older preacher, George Stroud, urged him to try, though, and Lipscomb prepared carefully. He worked through about 10 verses of scripture, but when he stood up to speak, his mind went totally blank. He could not remember a single planned word. He read the chapter aloud, hoping that the ideas would return, but they did not. Finally, he sat down in confusion and asked Stroud to take over. Well, Stroud was so startled that he also stumbled, and the service ended with both men just humiliated. As they rode away on horseback afterwards, Stroud tried to encourage him. "Brother David, I hope you will not let this discourage you," he said. Well, Lipscomb's answer carried his usual blunt humor. He told Stroud that he would do his best not to be discouraged, but that it was enough to shake any young man's confidence to see a preacher of 50 years make the kind of failure that Stroud had just made. So that was David Lipscomb in a nutshell. Shy in public, utterly honest, and willing to speak plainly, even when it stung. So when the war came to an end when the war started in 1861, Lipscomb had already settled his convictions. He believed firmly that a Christian must take no part in war. He preached that conviction openly wherever he went. He stayed out of both Union and Confederate politics. And for that, both sides denounced him. They wrote letters to political leaders explaining his position, and then he just kept on farming and he kept on preaching. Picture that for a moment. Confederate supporters accused Lipscomb of being a Union sympathizer, and Union supporters accused him of favoring the Confederacy. Neither side can make sense of a man who just would not shoulder a rifle for either flag. They just couldn't handle that. So drop a comment and tell me what you think of that stand. Could you have done that too? Do you know anyone who has held a hard biblical conviction while catching fire from both directions? I really want to hear it. Okay, so even before the war was over, David Lipscomb had made up his mind that once the fighting ended, that Gospel Advocate periodical, it had to come back to life to strengthen and reconnect the scattered brethren. So when the Gospel Advocate reappeared on January 1st, 1866, the biggest change sat at the top of the masthead. William Lipscomb, David's older brother and co-editor before the war, was no longer there. And in his place stood the name of the quiet Tennessee farmer with the shy manner, William. At 20, he had been the polished one. David now 34. Well, he was the one whose name would stand beside Fanning's for the next 4 years. Fanning wrote the opening greeting. In plain terms, he said that after 4 long, painful years of silence, he and Lipscomb were deeply thankful to God for the chance to speak again. He explained that their earnest desire was to work with every sincere Christian to proclaim the claims of Christ and to resist anything that opposed the rule of Christ. Lipscomb later explained why the Advocate had to be reborn. In his view, there was not a single paper in the South that ordinary Christians could read without being stabbed by political material. The Advocate would certainly share the feelings of Southern Christians who had suffered in the war, but it would not reduce itself to a political sheet. It would stand against instrumental music. It would stand against the Missionary Society. Northern churches looked elsewhere for their reading material. The Christian Standard, that was launched a few months later, became their main paper. Without anyone planning it, the Brotherhood gradually divided along what paper you read. The South read the Advocate, the North read the Standard. Over time, the map of the religious split followed the map of the printing press. Early years were brutal financially for the Gospel Advocate. There was no real office for it. The paper was printed under contract. Nashville remained under heavy federal occupation. Mail service was limited. Lipscomb lived 12 miles outside the city and rode in on horseback to handle business. To save time and money, he would sometimes stay in town for days, living in bare, unheated rooms and eating cold food. More than once, the paper came close to death. By 1868, it had finally pulled through the financial storm, though. And Fanning slowly stepped back. The whole editorial burden landed on David Lipscomb. In January of 1870, E.G. Sewell joined him as co-editor. Lipscomb's health was fragile during these years. He suffered from lung bleeding, harsh coughing, and what doctors called biliary derangement. In 1867, he went to Cleveland for a water treatment, and while he was there, he met Isaac Errett for the first time. Lipscomb was famous for his blunt honesty. Some of his critics said he was too sound, so straight that he leaned over. Errett once described him as a man fully armored, open about his disagreements, and ready to step into the ring and fight it out honorably. Now, Errett also remarked that Lipscomb might be a little too frank at times, and that his poor health and naturally serious temperament tended to make him expect the worst. By 1875, Ben Franklin came to Franklin, Tennessee for a protracted meeting, and before that visit, he hardly knew David Lipscomb. Afterward, he wrote his impression in the American Christian Review. Franklin portrayed Lipscomb as a plain, unpretentious man with childlike simplicity, strong native common sense, and great devotion to the cause of Christ. Franklin added that there was no danger of Lipscomb ever turning into a professional clergyman. V.M. Metcalf, who knew Lipscomb well for more than 25 years, said that he had never met a more godly or self-giving man. He described Lipscomb as gentle and affectionate like a child, easily led to do almost anything for others unless he believed it was wrong. And once his conscience said no, Metcalf said, there was not enough pressure in the world to move David Lipscomb. All right. So one thing before we're done, notice how West chooses to open this volume. He does not begin with a calendar date or a summary of the situation. He starts with a single wagon on a lonely road, a squat farmer, a shabby print shop, and an occupied city. The next concrete detail he gives is not a statistic, but a scene. That's a storyteller's craft, not just record keeping for a historian. So West could have opened on Isaac Errett sketching plans for the Christian Standard. He could have started at a missionary society convention. Instead, though, he points the camera at one Tennessee farmer delivering handwritten pages to a Nashville printer. The man you open the book on is the man that you have decided is the main character of the book, because this is a new book. It is volume 2, chapter 1. And West has made his choice. The next 400 pages will keep circling back to that choice. All right, if this walkthrough of David Lipscomb gave you a name that you did not realize was so central to the church that you grew up in, do me a favor. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, tap that notification bell, and share this episode with anyone who's been told that the churches of Christ have no founders and no beginning. Let me know in the comments, was Lipscomb's name something that you grew up hearing or not? Is this all new ground for you? I'd like to know. So tune in next time for chapter 2, titled Isaac Errett. The other side of the page is where we're going next. Make sure you go to thatsjesus.org for links to this and all of my series playlists on YouTube, like my baptism series and my eschatology series. Again, thanks for tuning in. We end every episode with the same question. Are you trusting something to save you, or are you trusting the Savior? I'm Bob Baulch with the That's Jesus channel. Have a great day and be blessed.